Hey, how's it going guys? My name is Dom, and today with the help of HTML, CSS and JavaScript, we're going to be creating a dice roll. So if I was to hit roll dice right here, it's going to roll the dice. Very straightforward, but it's actually a really good learning exercise for JavaScript and CSS, especially the JavaScript side. So going inside this tab right here, let's begin from scratch to, of course, create what I just showed you. Now, all of the source code is going to be linked down below, and I encourage you to download and follow along while you watch today's video. So going inside the text editor right here, I've got this index.html file with a linked CSS and JavaScript file. Now, I've got the CSS linked at the top here inside the head, but I've also got the script inside the head using the defer attribute to ensure it gets loaded and executed only once the document is loaded up, to of course avoid any errors with elements not being found and so on. Okay. Going inside the body, let's begin on this dice roller game. So we're going to begin by creating a new div with a class of dice-container. And of course, this right here is going to hold all of the dice. Now, as an example, so we can see what the CSS does, we can create a div with a class of dice right here. And this is going to represent a single dice. Now, I do know that my grammar isn't correct there, okay? But I am going to be saying a single dice in this video. So we have this dice right here. And of course, let's start off simple by displaying a 1 on the dice. So we'll create a new div with a class of dice-dot. And we're going to have a single dot element within this dice to give us, of course, our single dot for the 1. Okay, cool. Now, right below the dice container, let's create a new button with a type of button, okay, and a class of btn-roll-dice. And inside the button, we're just going to say roll dice as the label. Okay, so this right here is basically all we need, when it comes to the HTML for this dice roller. We are, of course, going to be removing this, this example dice and move that logic to the JavaScript eventually, but for now, we'll keep it here so we can track our CSS progress. Let's now go inside the browser and refresh here, and we just get that button being displayed. So going inside the CSS, let's add some magic to actually get the dice being displayed. So let's begin by targeting the dice container. And for the container, we're going to simply say display of flex. And this is going to ensure that, of course, all of our dice are going to be lined up next to each other horizontally. Okay, so that's fine, just like that. We're also going to be targeting the btn-roll dice and give this a margin top of just 10 pixels. That way the button is a little bit further down compared to the dice container. And now if we hop within the container and the button, this is where it gets interesting. So let's begin by targeting the class of dice, representing a single dice. Let's give this a width of 80 pixels and a height of also 80 pixels and a position of relative. The reason for the relative positioning here is so we can position the dots exactly where we want them relative to the actual dice face itself. So more on this shortly, but just make sure you have the position of relative set here. I'm also going to give this a margin of 5 pixels and a border radius of 10 pixels, and also a box shadow of 0, 0, then 10 pixels, then RGBA 0, 0, 0, and then 0.25 for a 25% subtle fade. I'll save this, go back in the browser here, refresh, and we get this right here. So we can see we've styled up the actual, dice container, the dice itself, and of course the button. Now, for some reason, I'm not getting the margin top being displayed there. So let's go back here and try and figure it out. Okay, so class is btn-roll dice. Let's make sure that's correct here. And it is. So I'm not sure why that's... okay. Class with two S's is going to work a lot better than one S. So let's rename that attribute to be class. Save this back in the browser, refresh, and now that space has been added. So let's now get back on track and style the dot to represent the 1 as the dice number. So let's go down here. We're going to be targeting the class of dice dot. Now, keep in mind that in the case of a number 5 on a dice, we're going to get 5 dots within that. Okay, so that's going to be handled using JavaScript, but of course in this case here, we've got a single dot for a 1. All right. Let's go back inside here now. So for these dots, we're going to be setting a width of 15 pixels, a height of 15 pixels, a background color of black, so 000, just like that, and a border radius of 50%. I'll save this, go back in the browser here, refresh, and we get this right here. A 50% border radius is going to ensure it is a circle. Let's now hop down here and say dot positioning. Okay, so all of these properties are going to relate to the positioning of the dot. So for this, we're going to say a position of absolute. By using absolute, it's going to allow us to position the dot relative to the parent dice because this one here has a position of relative. Let's now hop back down here. We're going to say a top of 50% and a left of 50%. This right here is going to position the dot approximately in the center of the dice. I'll refresh and we get that right there. As we can see, it is not centered just yet, but we can actually handle that by adding one more CSS property to basically push it back to where it should be. So going back inside the index.html here, or my mistake, the main.css file, we're going to say transform here, then say translate x, then within here, I'm going to say negative 50% and a translate y of, again, negative 50%. So now it's going to offset the extra positioning that was added there, as you've seen right here. So if I was to refresh, it goes back to where it should be. And essentially what this is doing is it's just a trick to get the, essentially where the center point is of the positioning to the center of the element. Okay, that's all it's doing, right? So now we have the dot perfectly positioned in the center. Now, there is an extra thing to do to our dot here. So we're actually going to be utilizing CSS variables in order to more easily position the dot in the JavaScript. So really, what we're seeing here is we're seeing in the case of a 1, we want the single dot to be in the center. But what if you were to display a 2? If I go back to the example, we have a 2 as the fourth dice here. In this case here, we've actually got the dot, and the first dot is 20% from the top and 20% from the left. And the second dot is 80% from the left and 80% from the top, if that makes sense. So essentially, we want to be able to just say this dot is 80-80, this dot is 20-20, this dot is 20-80, and so on, if that makes sense, right? So in order to more easily do that, we can use CSS variables. So at the top here, let's say under dice dot dash dash top equal to 0%. then say dash dash left equal to 0%. And these are our defaults. We're going to be using JavaScript very shortly to generate these dots and apply our own percentages. But for now, we have these CSS variables declared. They currently don't do anything, but we can now utilize them inside the top and the left properties as well as the transform. So inside here, I'm just going to say var, then say dash dash top, and the same goes for the left, this time saying var dash dash left. Now, the x-axis refers to the left property. So inside here, we're going to specify var, then say dash dash left. But of course, we need negative 50% and not just 50%. So how do we take this variable and convert it into a negative? Well, we can just say here using CSS, we can say calc, then say var left times -1, which is going to, of course, make whatever the whole number is a negative. We can do the exact same thing inside the y, but this time reference the top property instead. Let's save this, go back in the browser, refresh, and it is now in the top left corner because we said 0 and 0. What if we were to say 20 and 80? In this case here, I expect the dot to be in the bottom left corner, or actually in the top left corner, because I'm saying 20 for the top and 80 for the left. Actually, it's going to be in the top right corner. I'll refresh and there we go. So it's now 2080. What if I was to say 80 and 80? In this case, go back, bang, bottom right corner. So we can see here, this is how the dots are going to work. So basically, we're going to use JavaScript to generate those dots programmatically and those dice, and simply set those variables using inline styles, and it's going to give us our dice solution. So we're now done with all of the CSS for our dice roller. And I'm also going to set those top and left properties, or those variables, back to 0%. So now let's generate some more numbers using JavaScript. So going inside this main.js file, let's create a new function called createDice. Then inside here, let's provide a number to create. So if I was to say create dice and then provide 4, I want a single dice element with 4 dots inside of it, and each of those 4 dots are going to be positioned in the correct position: top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right. Okay, so let's remove the example dice and make the container back to containing nothing. Then going inside the main.js, let's create a dot position matrix. Now, I encourage you to once again view the source code down below so you can copy what I'm about to copy myself. So I'll paste this inside here, and it contains a matrix of all of the positions for every dot. So in the case of a 1 on the dice, a single dot 50-50 in the center. A 2 is going to be 2 dots, 1 and 2. The first one being 20-20 top left, bottom being 80-80, bottom right, and so on. We can see here for the 6, we get 6 dots, 20-20 top left, 20-80 for the middle left, 50-20 for the, my mistake, 20-80 was the top right, 50-20 for the middle left, 50-80 for the middle right, 80-20 for the bottom left, 80-80 for the bottom right. So that's how it's going to work. Once again, I encourage you to pause the video, or you can simply copy and paste the source code. I'm just going to minimize this constant here, then hop down, and we're now going to be creating a dice element itself. So I'll say const dice equal to document.createElement here. And we're going to say create a new div. We're going to be adding a class of dice to the div by saying dice.classList.add and add the class of dice. Okay? Let's now simply return the dice just to see our progress. I'll now say console.log create dice, then provide 3 inside there. I'll save this, go back in the browser, refresh here, go inside the dev console, and we get a div being returned from that function with a class of dice, but of course we are yet to add the dots in. So going back inside the JavaScript, let's go between our line 40 and line 44 and simply loop over our chosen number within the dot matrix or dot position matrix. So we'll say for const dot position of, then say here dot position matrix, then pass the number in. So number 3 being passed in is going to go down. It's going to choose this array right here to loop over. All right. So every single dot position is going to be a set of 2 numbers. In this case here, it's going to be 2020, then 5050, then 8080. So 3 loop iterations. Let's go inside here now. And we're going to say const dot equal to document dot create elements. Once again, creating a new div. And for the div, we're going to say dot class list dot add a dice dash dot class. We're also going to be appending the dots to the dice itself. So I'll say dice dot append child, then append the dots. Okay. And between these 2 lines, we're going to set the top and the left CSS variables. So we're going to say style set property, then say dash top equal to dot position at index 0 being the first number in the array, then say plus %sign to of course add the %sign to the string. I'll copy this down, then say dash left instead and make it at index 1. So now if I was to save this, go back in the browser, refresh, the dice contains 3 elements. They're all dice dots. We have top 20 and 20, top 50 and 50, top 80 and left of 80. So we've got those CSS styles set, and now the style sheet is going to utilize these 2 variables, top and left, to of course place them inside our positioning code. Okay, so now we have this working. If I was to say create dice for 6, save this, refresh, now we get 6 dots all in the correct position. So let's now append this 6 to the container. Okay. Let's get a reference to the dice container in JavaScript. So we can say const dice container equal to document.query selector, then say a class of dice container, just like that. And while we're here, we may also get a reference to the btn roll dice equal to document.query selector and passing in here btn-roll dice, just like that. So let's add that 6 to the dice container. We can say dice container dot append child. Then within this function or method, I can say create dice for 6. I'll save this, go back and refresh, and we get 6 right there. Let's try again with 4, save, refresh, and it works. So make sure you test 1 through to 6, but you should see it working just fine if you copied the matrix correctly. Cool. We have the create dice function made, which means we can now create random, or not random, but we can create dice at a specified number using some JavaScript code. So naturally, the next step is going to be to create random dice using JavaScript, a set of random dice. So let's hop down here and say function randomize dice. Now the randomized dice function is going to take in the dice container because that's where we're going to be appending the number of dice to, as well as the number of dice. So I'll say here dice container as a parameter, and the number of dice, just like that, as the second parameter. So when the page loads up, let's call randomized dice, pass in the dice container, and we're gonna say 5 as the number of dice to generate or randomize, okay? So the first step inside the randomized dice is going to be to clear out any existing dice. Dice container.innerHTML equal to an empty string. Then hopping down here, we're going to simply use a traditional for loop to say for let I equal to 0, I less than number of dice, then I plus plus. So of course, we're going to get number of dice amount of loop iterations here. And within this loop, we can generate a random number between 1 and 6, then create that dice based off that random number, then simply append it to the container. So const random is equal to math.floor, math.random times 6, of course 6 being the max number of, or the max number on a dice, right? Then we say plus 1 to give us that 1 through 6 inclusive random number. We can now say const dice equal to create dice for the random number. Then say dice container dot append child and append that dice. I'll save this, go back in the browser, refresh, and we get 5 random dice. I'll try again, and we keep getting 5 random dice being generated. Now, there is one thing to do here, which is going to be to get rid of this magic number. We can at least put it within a constant instead. So let's go up here and say const number of dice in all caps equal to 5. Then I'll say here number of dice as the argument. Okay, save this, refresh, same thing. If I was to say, for example, 2 instead, go back in the browser, now we only get 2 dice being generated. So it's up to you how you want to manage this number. Maybe you want to extend this solution by adding an input field which contains the number of dice to generate. But besides that, let's now make this button work. If I go back inside here, let's put this back to 5, and I'm going to minimize our 2 functions, okay? So how do we get this button to work? Well, very straightforward. I'm going to say btn roll dice dot add event listener. When the button gets clicked on, we're going to run this function. What is this function going to do? Well, it's going to call randomize dice, pass in the dice container, and also the number of dice. Save this back in the browser, refresh, and now if I click roll dice, we get the dice being generated. Now, I do encourage you to call randomized dice as the page loads up, just like that. That way, it's going to load with 5 random dice as opposed to nothing, and the button is still going to work, as we can see. But there is one thing missing. That, of course, is the small animation before it stops on 5 dice. So how do we do that? Quite straightforward. We're going to be using set interval and set timeout. Going back inside the code here, when we click on the button, we're going to say const interval is equal to set interval. So by using set interval, we're able to execute a bit of code every X amounts of milliseconds. So we're going to say here, every 50 milliseconds, we're going to execute whatever's inside this arrow function. And of course, you may have guessed it, it's going to be randomize dice, passing in the dice container, then passing in number of dice as the constant. Now, what this constant interval is, this is an identifier for the interval itself. So by storing that, it allows us to then clear the interval at a later time. If I was to save this, go back in the browser, refresh, and I click on roll dice, every 50 milliseconds, we're getting a random set of dice. So let's stop this after 1 second. Go back inside here, okay, back inside VS Code. We're now going to say set timeout, then say here, clear interval inside the arrow function, then say interval, just like that. And all this is going to happen after 1 second or 1000 milliseconds. So after 1 second, clear the interval which we assigned right above. If I go back in the browser, refresh, click on roll dice, after 1 second, bang, it is going to stop. And you can go again, and of course it's going to work. So that right there is how to create a dice roller using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Hope this video helped you out. If it did, make sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.